Oftentimes, especially when we get started, people tend to overly simplify and frankly incorrectly look at numbers where they do something along the lines of my return's going to be rent minus mortgage minus insurance and minus property taxes and everything else is profit. But a big one is the cost of a house or getting it ready when a tenant leaves and you want to place a new tenant.
8% equates to about 1 month of vacancy per year. Now, if you're turning tenants every year, you're not going to run a very profitable business. Welcome back to our special podcast series, The 20-Minute Investor, where we bring you actionable nuggets and insights from our real estate investing journeys in bite-sized 20-minute episodes. I'm Aaron Amin. My wife and I built a portfolio of 8 cash-flowing rentals across 3 states while working full-time and raising a young family.
And I'm Nathan Murith. I'm a husband, father, a tech executive who built a portfolio of cash-flowing rentals across 2 states from over 2,000 miles away.
Together, we co-founded the Remote Real Estate Academy, where we coach investors on how to build their own portfolios of cash-flowing rentals from anywhere in the world. So today, we're going to wrap up our 5-part series on the biggest mistakes remote investors make. And this one applies actually whether you're investing down the street or 3,000 miles away. And the mistake is failing to plan for vacancies and tenant turnover. So we're going to talk about how to run your numbers the right way, how we budget for vacancy, and what we actually do to keep great tenants around longer. So let's jump in. All right, so vacancy. This is a fun one because I think oftentimes people just assume that they can get a good tenant in place and keep them, but it is also one of the biggest expenses you can face if you're not careful about it. So let's start with just like the overall rule of thumb and percentages. I know we talked about this in one of the previous of the mistake series with cash flow analysis, but do you have a blanket percentage that you use when you're looking at vacancy?
I do, but maybe if I may, just step back for a second before we get into the actual details of stuff, because it is, I don't know if it was the last episode, the one before, one of the previous episodes that we recorded, we talked about this. And I think it starts with maybe a quick reminder. We're talking about how oftentimes when people analyze a deal or run their numbers, or when worse, in my opinion, people online pitch a rental that they want to sell and show you the quote numbers and the return that it'll generate. Oftentimes, especially when we get started, people tend to overly simplify and frankly incorrectly look at numbers where they do something along the lines of my return's going to be rent minus mortgage minus insurance and minus property taxes and everything else is profit. And we talked about that in detail, so go listen to that episode, but that's very far from the truth, right? And one of the things that typically people tend to forget to account for when they run their numbers, of course, you have things like property management, you have capital expenditure reserve, you have repairs, you have things like that. But a big one, which we talked about in this previous episode, is the cost of a house or getting it ready when a tenant leaves and you want to place a new tenant. And to put that in context, maybe to start off with specific numbers, and I didn't pull this up before now, but I'm just going off the top of my head for a relatively recent. So think of a relatively vanilla 3-bed, 2-bath, 1,000 square foot home, and tenant has stayed in it for say 3 to 4 years. When they leave and you want to get the property ready for the next tenant to come in, there's always going to be, work that you need to do to the property, from maybe as simple as painting a few rooms to maybe worse, right? Patching holes in walls and painting the walls and replacing flooring and maybe fixtures and things like that. And that's what we talk about when we talk about cost of a tenant turn. And I want to say the most recent one that comes to mind for us, it was something like $4,000, I think, if I remember correctly. This is off the top of my head, but ballpark. And that was a relatively, quote, simple or vanilla turn and make ready. So it's basically paint and flooring, I think, if I remember correctly, and everything else was okay. That $4,000, as an example here, will be a big hit to your return if you don't account for it. Sorry, that was a big step back and segue into your original question, but we do a few things in terms of numbers specifically. So obviously, and again, we talked about this in this previous episode that we did, but we account for just ongoing repairs. So hopefully that percentage, in our case, it's 5%. 5% is not gospel. Everybody needs to do their own numbers, talk to their own property manager. It's a number that works for me and the properties that we buy in the market that we buy those properties. It is not a number, the blanket statement, everybody use 5%. Just want to be very clear, that works for us. Hopefully a lot of the ongoing day-to-day repairs and things that break could get covered by that. In addition to that, we have, I mentioned it a second ago, but we put another 5% aside as reserves for bigger expenses. So that's not typically associated to a tenant turn, but things when you have to replace a water heater or a furnace or a roof or some of these big ticket items. So we put money aside for that, another 5%. One thing we touched on in that previous episode as well that we like to do is try to put every month, put a certain number of money aside from the incoming rents to anticipate and build treasure chest for having a set number of dollars set aside for when a tenant leaves and we have to get the property ready, floors, paint, fixtures, whatever it is, that has already been reserved or prepaid for by the current tenants. And we typically do $500 a year because for us, if a tenant stays on average 4 to 5 years, that builds up a decent treasure chest of reserves for fixing up the property. And I've got more stuff to say, but maybe I'll shut up for a second and see what you have to say.
No, context is super helpful. And just naming a percentage without framing the overall context of what it takes to turn over a property and get a new tenant in is not very helpful. So I appreciate you framing that whole thing. And I think what the theme I hear there is that these reserves that we set aside for things like normal expected repairs, bigger CapEx expenses, vacancy itself, which in my mind, the definition of vacancy is when there is nobody in there paying rent. So it's the amount that you're budgeting for to cover that lost rent potential. But that is not the only expense of vacancy. It is also, like you said, painting, replacing carpets if needed, all the patch up and turnover work, the lease up fee that goes to your property manager. So you're pulling from all these different allocations to come up with the whole true cost of turning over a unit. And I think that's actually the point of this episode and the point of this lesson is that vacancy in and of itself is not in a vacuum. The lost rent potential is one line item on your P&L and your allocations, but you're actually pulling from a bunch of different categories. So if you've been collecting rent, even if you have a tenant stay for 2 or 3 years, but you've been shoving all that excess gross cash flow into your operating account and then drawing it to pay your cell phone bill and go on vacation, then when that 3-year period expires and you haven't been accruing properly, that's going to hurt. And that's the point here. And this lesson really does apply whether you're local or remote. But I think in particular, when you're remote, you have less ways to solve problems if you have not properly budgeted and accrued for those expenses. So I think it's really important, the picture you painted, where there's different categories that you're pulling from to cover what is considered to be the holistic expense of a tenant turnover. So the other thing I remember you mentioned in the previous episode was that because you've been in your market for as long as you have, because you have an established track record with your property manager, you can actually come up with a better estimated percentage of what all these things cost. If you're a brand new investor, then in my mind, I usually err on the side of caution and I use a number like an 8% vacancy. If I'm going into a new market where I don't fully understand what it's going to take to retain long-term tenants, I'm still feeling out my processes and how to settle in, find the right tenant match for the building that can hopefully have a long-term tenancy. 8% equates to about 1 month of vacancy per year. Now, if you're turning tenants every year, you're not going to run a very profitable business. So I'm not suggesting that's my target or that's my goal is to turn over tenants every year. But what I am suggesting is that when I use that number, if stuff's still penciled out and I'm using an 8% vacancy and maybe a slightly higher repair and CapEx number, then I know that if I got a little green light on my deal check or my Remote Real Estate Academy deal analyzer, there's these little red light, green light. Does this deal work for the parameters you need? If I'm budgeting conservatively and the light is still green, then that is exactly what it is to me. It's a green light. This deal can work even under the circumstances of me having to turn this over every year. And then of course, the goal is to outperform that and get tenants that'll stay for, I would love to know your answer to this of what you consider to be like a good metric for how long people stay. But in my mind, if I can get an average stay of 2.5 to 3 years on my long-term rentals that are in the kind of working class neighborhoods, to me, that's pretty good. Obviously you would like longer, but I'm curious to get your thoughts on what do you consider to be a good, healthy tenant, like tenure, if you will?
Yeah, that's a great question. It's not like we have a goal that we're trying to reach. We'll do everything we can to reach a goal of, say, X number of years per tenancy. It's not a goal of ours. But that said, I'm sure folks have heard this and it's said a lot in kind of the real estate investing space, but one of the most expensive and costly things that will destroy the returns of a rental property is a tenant turn, for the reasons we've just discussed. Is you can build up all this cash flow, and maybe even if you don't spend it, you just put it all aside, build it up for a year, two, whatever, then a tenant leaves. And now you just use up all that cash flow to get the property ready, especially if you haven't conservatively run your numbers and budgeted for tenant turns. So we do everything we possibly can to keep tenants as long as possible. So that starts with our buy box, where we try to make sure we are in decent school districts, because we as the parents, we understand that if you get your kids and all their crap into a house that has relatively decent schools, it's pretty hard to move when you got a basement full of kid stuff. We've all been there, I think, or you and I at least have been there. So it starts with that, but then it's clean, safe property. So we do everything we can to have a clean, safe property. We do everything we can to keep them. Like when we do annual rent increases, we don't go super aggressive. As if we rent at X and the market is 50% above that, we won't go from one year to the next. So here's a 50% rent increase. We'll do a smaller increase to help absorb our increase in costs, but we'll do everything to make sure the tenant stays. So sorry, long answer. We talk to them as much as we possibly can so that we have an open relationship and we figure out what, and when I say we, our property manager and tenants talk, and then that gets relayed to us, just to make sure that we have open lines of communication and we do what is needed to retain them as long as we possibly can. That said, looking historically at our average tenancy, I think we're probably going on about 5 years. And this is off the top of my head. I didn't run the actual numbers, but I've maybe four to five. It's been a good run.
So that would be, in my mind, a pretty exceptional result, right? If your average tenant stay is above 4 years, that means that you're managing communication, you're managing expectations, you're keeping good care of the property. You're probably selecting the right types of tenants that are qualified to live there and are in a stable enough position that they can afford those incremental rent increases. So that's an example in my mind of a very functional end-to-end process, because you might have people that are really nice that you like. You might have people that can afford rent for a certain period of time, but they can't afford the eventual increases. Maybe the rent that they enter in is at the very high end of their price range. There's a lot of things that can go wrong throughout a 4 or 5 year period with increasing marginal costs. So I think it just highlights the importance of understanding your tenant pool and who the right profile is. And I say profile, and I want to be very careful with that word, because obviously discrimination, and you got to be really careful not to,
of course,
unfairly discriminate against anybody. But there is such a thing as trying to understand, meet the market where it is. And if you're in a D-class neighborhood and you're trying to charge B-class rent, like the type of person who eventually might pay that, if anybody, is probably not the right person long-term to live in that area. So you do have to really understand the dynamics of the market you're in, the people you're trying to attract, the neighborhoods you're in, and those dynamics, whether it's the school districts or the crime, whatever the stats that people care about in those areas, those all play into whether you can really retain people or not. And I think a 4+ year is amazing. And that is why a lot of what we focus on when we're teaching people, it's how to understand each component of that. I don't know whether to call it a funnel or just the tenant life cycle, but from selecting to retaining. And I think maybe I would love for you to share a little more too about how you and your property manager manage the renewal conversations when those times come.
Yeah, and before I jump into that, there's another piece to this that helps understand and keep checks and balances with our tenants and how they take care of the property. We do annual inspections so our property manager will ask if we want to. It costs something. It's not excessive, but there's a fee to it. But they will do an annual inspection of these rental properties. And what that does is the tenants know that at some point during the year, during their lease, the property manager is going to come by and walk the property to make sure it's in good standing, taken care of, so on and so forth. So we can also, through that, ensure that we have tenants that are taking care of the properties. Because if not, then we know we can choose to, for example, not renew a lease. We also touched on this, I think, in a previous episode as well, but some of our properties have housing authority or section tenants in there, and the housing authority also has their annual walkthrough and inspection, which helps keep things in check. But yeah, when we get to so obviously we use a property manager. So it's not like I'm having these conversations with the tenants, but the instruction that I give the property manager is like, I want to do everything. And I have the same email I send every single year. Every time a lease comes up for renewal on every one of our properties, it's the same email that basically says, I want to do everything reasonable and possible to keep the tenant in. I also, as everyone else, have increasing expenses, property taxes, insurance, repairs, anything. I want to make sure we do what's best to keep them in, but also some form of increase. And I would much rather do a $25, $50 rent increase on a $1,500 monthly rent and keep the tenant rather than that tenant saying, I'm leaving, and then it's going to cost me $4 or $5 to fix the property up. Even though, and knowing that if this were a vacant property and I were to put it on the market today, I could get $1,800 in rent, right? I'd rather keep the tenant and get $1,525 rather than risking in trying to push it to $1,800 or $1,700 or whatever and have the tenants leave.
Yeah, 100%. And I think a couple of things I want to just highlight. The Section 8, I know we've talked about before. We actually have a assisted living operator renting one of our homes. In both of those scenarios, in mine, it's the state, and in yours, I know it's the housing authority. But those act as these, I think they're advantageous checks and balances, because then the tenants are not only concerned about whether or not they can impress you as to how they're taking care of the house. There's actually an outside party coming in to verify that the house is in good working order, that any safety concerns are addressed, and that ultimately like everyone is doing their part, both the tenant and the landlord. And I appreciate that, especially as an out-of-state investor, because I don't know, you don't want people too up in your business, but I do think that when you have multiple sets of eyes on it between a property manager, whatever that authority is, the tenant and the landlord, you're more likely to keep things in check and keep everyone's expectations aligned. I think when things go wrong is when there's a gap between people's expectations and the reality of the situation. So even something like that $25 a month increase, if a tenant is just expecting things to stay flat, that might have been also a failure on our part to set their expectations when they join, right? It could be written in your lease. It could be part of the communication you have with them, that there will be a marginal rent increase every year to keep pace with inflation and rising costs. This isn't just because you're a greedy landlord out to try and put them on the street. It's because you incur costs from ownership. And a lot of people fail to understand that, but if you're good about communicating that in an empathetic way, where you acknowledge that this is additional money out of their pocket, all you're really asking for in return is for them to acknowledge the same, that you have rising costs for holding. And so I think that's all just about how to manage the tenant life cycle.
I mean, if you're going to try, in the example I was given before, if you're going to try to, from 1 year, when your lease is up and you're having those conversations for renewal with your tenant and you're trying to go from 15 to 1,800, yes, you're going to come across as a greedy landlord, most likely. If you do these more nominal changes and you explain that you also have increasing costs, then usually the conversation goes much smoother.
Yes, absolutely. Hopefully this gave a good idea of some of the ways that Nathan and I think about how to retain tenants and avoid big expense of vacancy, and how to underwrite it into your initial offers that you're making on remote rentals. So thank you guys for joining on the 20-Minute Investor, and we will see you next time. Thank you for making it to the end of today's episode. As you may know, podcasts are very difficult to grow organically. If you're getting value from today's episode, I'd deeply appreciate if you can take 30 seconds to leave my show a 5-star rating and review. This will go a long way to helping me reach more listeners just like you. Thank you so much in advance.